May 1st, 1540. On a broad, grassy bluff overlooking a river the color of wet clay. The air is thick with the scent of blooming blackjack oak and the damp earth of recent spring rains. Below, the river, known as Choctaw to some, Alibamo to others, moves with a powerful, silent weight, a liquid highway cutting through a continent of green. On the bluff, the world is anything but silent. The rhythmic thud of a wooden pestle grinding corn in a hollowed log echoes from the edge of a large, organized town. Smoke from dozens of cookfares threads into the morning sky, carrying the smell of roasting venison and simmering beans. Children dart between dome-roofed houses, their walls woven from river cane and plastered with mud, their roofs thatched with palmetto fronds. This is not a lonely outpost. This is Atagi, a principal town of the Coosa chiefdom, part of the vast and interconnected Muskogean world. The people here are ancestors of those who will later be called Creek. They are in this moment the absolute power of this land. The viewer stands at the heart of a sophisticated ancient geography. For centuries, even millennia, this region has been meticulously mapped by footsteps, not parchment. A network of trails, worn deep by travel and trade, connects these riverine towns. One can follow the path from these bluffs down to the Gulf, where shells are gathered for sacred rituals and tools. Another trail leads northeast, into the muscular foothills, source of rare chert for arrowheads. The greatest power, however, flows on the rivers. Hollowed cypress log canoes, some over 30 feet long, glide along the Alabama, the Tombigbee, the Coosa, carrying not just goods, but news, marriage proposals, and diplomatic envoys. Look at the town's structure. The large, circular council house, its roof towering over the dwellings, is the political and spiritual heart. Here, the Miko chief and his advisors debate matters of war, peace, and justice, guided by a complex understanding of balance and reciprocity. The cleared plaza nearby is for the stickball games, the little brother of war, where alliances are tested and celebrated with athletic fury. In the surrounding fields, women tend to the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, cultivated together in a symbiotic dance that nourishes a large, settled population. This is not subsistence. This is an agricultural economy that produces surplus, stored in raised granaries, fueling trade and stability. This land is defined by use and meaning. The forests are not wilderness. They are a managed larder, periodically burned to create grazing for deer and clear underbrush. The rivers are not just roots. They are spiritual beings, home to underwater panthers and creators of the fertile black soil that lines their banks. The mounds that rise near major towns, platforms for the homes of leaders or temples for the sacred fire, are literal layers of history built basketful of earth by basketful of earth over generations. They are testaments to collective labor and a deep, enduring connection to place. Every element here speaks of a world in full, self-contained operation. The glint of a copper ornament, traded from the Great Lakes, adorns a priest's mantle. A spool-shaped earring carved from a conch shell harvested from the distant Gulf swings from a warrior's ear. The languages spoken, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and the northern reaches, are the original legal codes, the repositories of myth, the binding contracts of kinship. Control here is not about borders on a map, but about influence over people, knowledge of roots, and stewardship of resources. It is a power woven as tightly and as strong as the cane mats lining the walls of the council house. It is a world entire. And on this May morning in 1540, a tremor is coming from the southeast, a disturbance on the oldest trails, a story of metal, disease, and a hunger for gold that this riverine world cannot yet comprehend, but whose shadow is already falling across the path. April 20th, 1541. The same river bluff, but the air now tastes of fear and metal. The scent of the cookfires is laced with a new, acrid smell, the sweat of terrified horses and the greasy odor of Spanish steel. Where children once played, there is now a watchful, armed silence. The great town of Atagi, part of the Coosa chiefdom, is hosting, or is besieged by, a force from a nightmare. Hernando de Soto and his army of over 600 conquistadors, along with hundreds of enslaved indigenous porters from other nations, have erupted into the heart of this world. They are not traders in canoes. They are a moving fortress of ambition and brutality, clad in rusting armor, their faces hidden by beards and helmets, their weapons alien and cruel. For the viewer standing in the plaza, the dissonance is jarring. You see the Miko and his elders, draped in finely tanned deerskin and feathered mantles, standing with a ceremonial dignity they must force themselves to maintain. Facing them is De Soto, a man etched with the exhaustion and fanaticism of a year marching through unknown lands. His interpreters, a survivor of the earlier Narvi's expedition, enslaved Africans and captured guides from other tribes, struggle to translate demands for food, porters, and information about gold. There is no gold here. There is only the wealth of the land, the full granaries, the stores of dried beans and pumpkins. This De Soto takes. The Spanish are not settlers. They are extractors, a human hurricane stripping the land as they pass. They commandeer the town's houses for their own use. They shackle men as bearers. They demand women as consorts. Their pigs, which they've brought with them, root destructively through the carefully tended cornfields. The Muskogean people watch, learning fast. They see the Spaniards' obsessions, their desperate, almost pathetic fixation on yellow metal, their vulnerability away from their horses and ships, the strange power of their priests' wooden crosses and Latin incantations. But an invisible passenger has already leapt ahead of De Soto's march. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases against which these nations have no immunological memory. The first wave of pandemic likely swept through in the preceding years, carried by indirect contact from earlier Spanish expeditions along the coasts. Towns De Soto finds already seem diminished. Others he never sees at all, their populations collapsed, their social order unraveled in a storm of fever and death. The world's balance is hemorrhaging. De Soto's expedition is a bloody 3-year scar across the southeast. He dies in 1542, his body sunk in the great river he discovered, the Mississippi. His remaining men flee on makeshift rafts, but the damage is irrevocable. The illusion of European invincibility is shattered, but so is the indigenous geopolitical structure. The great paramount chiefdoms like Coosa and Tuscaloosa begin to fragment. Survivors consolidate into new, smaller, more mobile alliances for mutual defense. For the next 150 years, the land that will be Alabama exists in a state of recalibration. The Spanish establish a tenuous hold at places like Pensacola Bay, 1559, but their influence is coastal, their missions fragile. The interior becomes a refugia, the peoples regroup. The Creek Confederacy begins to coalesce from the fragments of the Mississippian world, a loose but powerful alliance of town-centric talwas like Abaca, Coweta, Tucabachi for collective security. They are not victims passively waiting for the next wave. They are adapters, shrewd geopolitical players in a new and dangerous continental game. By the late 1600s, a new pressure arrives from the south. French traders and coureurs des bois, pushing down from Canada and out from their nascent base at Mobile Bay, established 1702, approach with a different model than the Spanish. They come not with conquistadors but with trade goods, flintlock rifles, wool blankets, iron pots, and glass beads. The calculus for the indigenous nations shifts from pure defense to complex negotiation. A musket can give you an edge over your traditional enemies. A kettle can change a woman's daily labor. But these goods come with a cost, a new economic dependency and an entanglement in European rivalries. From the bluff, the river still flows. The towns are still there, though their names and alliances have evolved. The power is still indigenous, but it is now a power exercised in a world filling with shadows and new, tempting, dangerous tools. The land is no longer an entire, self-contained universe. It has become a prize, seen from afar on European maps labeled La Florida or Louisiane, its interior marked vaguely but covetously. The process of targeting is now explicit. The designs are being drawn, and the peoples of the rivers, the farmers of the black soil, must decide how to navigate a current that is pulling them inexorably toward a rapids. January 15th, 1712. A muddy stretch of land at the head of Mobile Bay, where the fresh water of the Mobile River meets the salt tide. The air is cold and damp, smelling of pine sap, river mud, and the peculiar scent of wet, raw timber being hewn into fortifications. The sound is a cacophony of French orders, the thud of axes, and the guttural Algonquian dialects of allied Illinois and Miami warriors. This is Fort Louis de la Louisiane, the bleeding-edge capital of a vast paper empire. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, the ambitious Canadian-born founder, paces along a nascent rampart. His gaze isn't on the impressive, if crude, log walls going up. It's fixed inland, up the river highways, the Mobile, the Alabama, the Tombigbee. He isn't just building a fort, he's placing a piece on a continental chessboard, and his intended opponents are both the Spanish in Florida and the English in Carolina. His necessary volatile partners are the indigenous nations who control every inch of the terrain beyond this palisade. The viewer stands at the genesis of Alabama's colonial geography. Mobile is the first permanent European settlement in what will become the state, but its survival is as thin as the parchment of its royal charter. It is utterly dependent on the indigenous world. The French have no agricultural base. They are traders, diplomats, and soldiers. Their lifeline is the gift and the trade. Every winter, delegations from the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Alabama towns arrive at the fort. The plaza becomes a swirling diplomatic theater. See the Choctaw delegation, the most numerous and crucial French allies, unloading bundles of deerskins, the new cash crop of the interior. In return, their Mingo's chiefs receive rifles, powder, vermilion paint, and brandy. The relationship is a careful bargain. French goods and military support against the Chickasaw and the English, in exchange for Choctaw loyalty and a river of pelts. But then watch a party of Upper Creek Micos from the towns along the Coosa and Tallapoosa. They are more aloof, playing a harder game. They accept French gifts, listen to Bienville's promises, but also send runners east to the English in Charlestown, where traders pay more for skins and ominously for Indian slaves. This is the great, horrific pivot of the early 1700s, the Indian slave trade. Spurred by English demand in Carolina and the Caribbean, allied tribes like the Savannah, Shawnee, and later the Creek and Chickasaw begin raiding their neighbors for human captives to sell. The violence is catastrophic, destabilizing whole regions and turning nations against each other in a cycle of retaliatory raiding. The French condemn it, but are powerless to stop it. The land becomes a hunting ground, not just for deer but for people. The French strategy is one of influence, not conquest. They build a string of small, symbolic forts. Fort Toulouse, established in 1717 at the confluence of the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers deep in Creek country, is the most important. It's not a military garrison so much as a listening post and a trading house, a physical manifestation of the French presence meant to keep the Creek out of the English orbit. A French officer there lives at the mercy of the Creek. He marries a Creek woman, creating kinship ties. He distributes medals and presents. He tries to arbitrate disputes. The power dynamics are clear. The fort is a guest in a powerful host's territory. Meanwhile, the English are advancing not with forts, but with packed trains and trade goods. Their traders, tougher and often less scrupulous, penetrate deeper, offering more goods on better terms. They flood the country with muskets. The nations, especially the Creek Confederacy, master this imperial rivalry. They become the balance of power. A Creek leader can threaten the French by mentioning a recent English trade offer and force the price of his alliance higher. This is the era of the playoff system, and the indigenous nations are its brilliant, ruthless practitioners. But the land bears witness to the slow shift. The great, ancient mound centers are no longer the sole hubs of power. New geographic points matter. The landing at Mobile, the clearing at Fort Toulouse, the trails leading to Charlestown. The economy is now tied to a global market, deerskins to make gloves for London gentlemen, slaves for Carolina rice plantations. The very fabric of life changes. A musket replaces a bow, a copper kettle replaces a clay pot, wool strands are woven into traditional garments. By 1763, the European chess game ends in a stunning checkmate, but not for the players on the ground. The French and Indian War concludes with the Treaty of Paris. France, defeated, cedes all of Louisiana east of the Mississippi, including Alabama, to the British. The French officers at Fort Toulouse lower the fleur-de-lis for the last time, board canoes, and depart. The Creek who watched them go felt a moment of uncertainty. One imperial father was gone. A new, more land-hungry one was about to arrive. The balance they had mastered was tipping. The playoff was ending, and a new, grimmer game of direct pressure was set to begin on the very ground where their ancestors' towns once thrived. August 3, 1813. A dusty crossroads at Burnt Corn Creek in the pine woods of the Mississippi Territory. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder, crushed greenery, and panic. Not the ordered volleys of European warfare, but the chaotic, personal fury of a frontier ambush and counter-ambush. A party of Alabama Red Sticks, a faction of Creek traditionalists enraged by American encroachment, has just clashed with a militia of American settlers and allied Lower Creeks. It's a messy, brutal skirmish, a spark hitting tinder. For the viewer here, the world has narrowed to the flash of a rifle, the thud of a war club, the guttural shouts in Muskogee, and the rough curses in English. This is no longer a diplomatic chess game between empires and nations. This is a civil war within the Creek Confederacy and a war for the land itself. The American shadow that first fell with the British takeover has now solidified into a crushing, undeniable presence. To understand this moment, you must rewind to 1763. The British Proclamation Line, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachians, was a parchment barrier against a human tide. American colonists, their eyes on the fertile Black Belt prairie of what is now central Alabama, ignored it. After the American Revolution, the new United States inherited Britain's claim to the region, but not its relationships. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, drew lines on maps that the Creek, who had never been conquered, simply laughed at. Their leader, the shrewd Alexander MacGillivray, a mixed-race Creek with a Scottish father, played a dangerous game. He signed the Treaty of New York 1790 with President Washington, guaranteeing Creek borders while secretly taking pensions from the Spanish in Florida as a counterweight. But the pressure was inexorable. American agents like Benjamin Hawkins, the beloved man of the Creek, pushed a civilization program. He urged Creek men to abandon hunting for plow farming and women to switch from farming to domestic weaving. The goal was to free up surplus hunting land that could then be ceded. New trails, called federal roads, were cut through Creek territory, becoming highways for settlers, livestock, and disease. The land itself was changing. The great deer herds, hunted to fuel the global skin trade, were vanishing. The economic foundation of Creek male power and independence was crumbling. This tension birthed the fault line. A new spiritual movement, inspired by the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, swept through the towns in 1811. It called for a rejection of American goods, American ways, and a return to ancient traditions. Its followers became known as Red Sticks. They saw the accommodating Creek leaders, often mixed race and tied to the trade economy, as traitors. The Civil War ignited. The spark at Burnt Corn Creek became a wildfire. On August 30th, 1813, the Red Sticks, in a desperate, defining act of defiance, attacked Fort Mims, a stockade full of American settlers and their Lower Creek allies on the Alabama River. The massacre was horrific, over 500 killed. For the viewer, the scene afterward is one of unspeakable horror. The fort, a charnel house, the summer heat thick with death, vultures circling. For the United States, it was a casus belli. The Creek Civil War became America's war. Into this storm marched Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee militia general with a deep personal hatred for Native Americans and an unquenchable hunger for land and glory. His army was a brutal instrument. Tennessee volunteers, U.S. regulars, and crucially, over 600 Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors, traditional enemies of the Red Sticks, now fighting alongside the Americans to ensure their own survival in the new order. The climax came on March 27, 1814, at a horseshoe-shaped bend in the Tallapoosa River, a place called Tohoka. The Red Sticks under Menawa had built a formidable barricade across the neck of the peninsula. Jackson's artillery pounded it. Then, in a two-pronged assault, his Cherokee allies swam the river to attack from the rear, while his main force stormed the breastworks. The battle was less a fight than a slaughter. Over 800 Red Stick warriors were killed, their bodies left in the mud and water. The Tallapoosa ran red. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, imposed that August, was a monument to vengeance and greed. Jackson forced not just the defeated Red Sticks, but all Creek factions, including his own allies, to sign. They ceded 23 million acres, over half of the Creek domain, including most of present-day Alabama and southern Georgia. It was the largest single land cession in U.S. history east of the Mississippi. The Creek nation was left shattered, a hollow shell on a fraction of its homeland. The viewer, standing in the eerie silence after Tohoka, witnesses the final, violent unraveling of the ancient indigenous power structure. The playoff system is dead. The balance of power is obliterated. The land, with its rivers, trails, and black belt soil, is now officially, irrevocably on American maps. The question is no longer if it will be settled, but how fast and by whom. The path is cleared not for nations, but for cotton, slaves, and a new, brutal economy that will rise from the very ground where Creek towns once stood. October 15, 1819. The muddy bank of the Alabama River at the newly plotted town of Montgomery. The air hums with a different kind of energy now, not the spiritual fervor of the Red Sticks, nor the grim silence after battle, but the cacophonous, greedy din of a land rush. Axes bite into virgin timber. Surveyors' chains clink as they lay out neat, rectangular lots on land that just 5 years prior was the heart of the Creek hunting grounds. Men in broadcloth coats and planters' hats argue over deeds and prices, their voices competing with the grunts of enslaved African men clearing stumps and raising the frames of clapboard buildings. This is the sound of a new Alabama being born, not from centuries of tradition, but from an act of speculative will. Alabama is about to become a state, and its entire reason for being is being hammered into existence on this riverbank. The viewer stands at the dawn of the Cotton Kingdom. The land ceded at Fort Jackson wasn't just territory, it was a revelation. American settlers, pouring down the federal road, discovered the Black Belt, a crescent of dark, rich limestone soil perfect for cultivating the new, short staple cotton. With the invention of the cotton gin making processing viable, this land became the closest thing to gold on the continent. Overnight, the economic purpose of Alabama was rewritten. It was no longer a crossroads of indigenous trade or a pawn in imperial rivalry. It was to be a machine for producing white gold. Statehood came in 1819. The first capital was at Cahaba, then Tuscaloosa, both river towns, arteries for shipping the bulky bales. But the real capital was wherever the next acre of forest could be felled and transformed into a cotton field. The pressure on the remaining indigenous land became unbearable. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and the shattered remnants of the Creek still held large swaths of the state, but their presence was now seen as an intolerable obstacle to progress. The political mechanism for their removal was coldly efficient. The federal government, with Andrew Jackson now president, passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. In Alabama, this meant a series of coercive, fraudulent, and often brutally enforced treaties. For the viewer, the scene shifts to a supposed negotiation, like the 1832 Treaty of Cusseta with the Creek. Picture a grove of trees, a few government agents with prepared documents, and a handful of Creek signatories who did not represent their people but were bribed or threatened. The treaty divided Creek land into individual allotments. Almost instantly, a swarm of speculators, squatters, and whiskey peddlers descended, using fraud, intimidation, and violence to cheat individual Creeks out of their parcels. The law, in the form of Alabama extending its jurisdiction over the nations, was wielded as a weapon to harass and disempower. Resistance flared and was crushed. In 1836, faced with starvation and violence, a faction of Creek fought a last, desperate war for their homes along the Chattahoochee. It was a hopeless revolt, put down by U.S. troops in weeks. The leaders were shackled, the people were rounded up. Now witness the trail of tears as it passed through Alabama. It is not a single moment but a season of suffering. For the Cherokee, their forced march west crossed the frozen Tennessee River in the brutal winter of 1838-39. But for the Creek and Choctaw, the journey often began earlier in the stifling heat. Imagine a stockade near present-day Montgomery, a holding pen where thousands of Creek men, women, and children are packed together, diseased and despondent, awaiting transport. They are then marched overland or loaded onto overcrowded, disease-ridden steamboats on the Alabama River for a journey south to the Gulf, then west to New Orleans and up the Mississippi. The land itself bears witness to this death march. A stretch of the removal route through central Alabama becomes known as the Creek Trail of Tears. You can almost hear the ghost of the procession, the muffled cries, the coughs of the sick, the clink of chains, the wagon wheels groaning. They are walking away from everything, the sacred mounds, the river towns, the graves of their ancestors, into an unknown and barren exile in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. By 1840, the erasure is nearly complete. The powerful nations that controlled every trade route, every river crossing, every fertile valley for millennia are gone. In their place, a new social and physical landscape is cemented. Vast plantations, worked by generations of enslaved Africans, now checker the Black Belt. Their labor transforms the stolen soil into wealth that flows to Mobile, to New York, to the textile mills of England. Montgomery, Selma, and Huntsville grow as commercial hubs for the slave-based cotton economy. The original names of the rivers and towns are kept: Alabama, Tallapoosa, Tuscaloosa, but as hollow souvenirs stripped of their meaning like trophies mounted on the wall of the conqueror. The viewer is left on a quiet river bluff, perhaps the same one from the start of our story. The council house is gone. The sound of the pestle is gone. The language on the wind is English. The power has been transferred violently and absolutely. The land has a name now, Alabama, and a new, brutal purpose. The targeting is complete. The design has been executed, and the deep, silent roots of the story are already being buried under feet of dark, lucrative soil. July 10, 1864. A shattered landscape outside Atlanta, Georgia, but the flame that forged it was lit in Alabama. The air is not simply hot. It is cooked, saturated with the sulfurous stink of spent gunpowder and the sweet, gagging odor of death. For the viewer standing in a trench scarred into Georgia clay, the thunder of artillery is a physical force. But the will that sustains this Confederate army, the political engine that demanded this war, and the economic system it fought to preserve, were incubated in the heart of Alabama. The state, born from cotton and slavery, had become the intellectual and industrial furnace of the Confederacy, and now it was burning itself to ash. To understand this fire, rewind to the 1850s. Alabama is at the peak of its antebellum power. Montgomery's riverfront is a mountain of cotton bales. The state capital, moved to Montgomery in 1846, hums not just with administration, but with the feverish politics of slavery's expansion. In the Black Belt, a planter aristocracy lives in Greek revival mansions. their wealth and social order built entirely upon the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. This is not a passive system. It is aggressive, paranoid, and deeply ideological. It must expand or die, its proponents believe. The moment of ignition comes in February 1861. Montgomery is no longer just a state capital. It is the epicenter of a revolution. In the ornate chamber of the Alabama state capitol, on a hill overlooking the city founded on Creek land, delegates from seceded southern states gather. The air is thick with cigar smoke, oratory, and destiny. Here, on February 18th, they establish the Confederate States of America. Here, Jefferson Davis is inaugurated as its president on the Capitol steps. For a few fleeting months, Montgomery is the Confederate capital. The viewer in that crowd hears the defiant cheers, sees the new flag unfurled. This is the culmination of Alabama's journey from a targeted land to a targeting power, now leading a nation founded explicitly to preserve and perpetuate the system of African-American chattel slavery. When the capital moves to Richmond, Alabama's role shifts from political to logistical. It becomes the industrial heart. At Selma, on the banks of the Alabama River, the Confederacy builds its most vital manufacturing complex, the Selma Arsenal and Naval Foundry. The landscape transforms. The quiet river town becomes a hellscape of industry, its sky lit at night by the blast furnaces. Enslaved people, free black laborers, often forced, and poor whites work under brutal conditions to forge cannons, ironclad ships like the CSS Tennessee, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia gets the fame, but Selma is the muscle. Similarly, the Briarfield Iron Works in Bibb County and facilities in Montgomery pour out the material of war. This industrial output is the only thing prolonging the Confederacy's life, but the furnace consumes its fuel. The same railroads that carried cotton now carry troops to their deaths. The men who cleared the land for cotton fields die in fields of fire at Shiloh and Gettysburg. And the very people the system was built upon, the enslaved, begin to dismantle it from within. As Union raids probe into Alabama, like Rousseau's raid in 1864 targeting the Oplica railways, freedom becomes tangible. Enslaved people flee plantations by the thousands, seeking Union lines, starving the Confederate economy of its essential workforce and providing the U.S. with vital labor and military intelligence. The war ends not with a distant surrender, but with the Battle of Selma on April 2, 1865. Union cavalry under James H. Wilson overrun the city's defenses. The great foundries, the pride of the Confederate war machine, are put to the torch. The viewer watches as the structures that forged defiance are themselves consumed, their iron skeletons glowing against the night sky, a fitting funeral pyre for the slaveholders' republic. Then comes Reconstruction, a fragile dawn. For a brief, radical period, Alabama is remade. In the same capital where secession was declared, a new constitution is written in 1868 by a biracial convention. African-American men, like Benjamin Sterling Turner, who would become Alabama's first black congressman, vote and hold office. The Freedmen's Bureau sets up schools, the first systemic education for black Alabamians. For the formerly enslaved, this is the promise: ownership, citizenship, dignity. But the promise is strangled in its crib. The old power structure, the planter class and their allies, strikes back with economic coercion, Ku Klux Klan terror, and political fraud. Violence isn't an anomaly, it is the tool of policy. The Compromise of 1877 is the final betrayal as federal troops withdraw and leave black citizens at the mercy of their former enslavers. By 1877, redemption is complete. A new constitution is being plotted, one that will use law to do what whips and chains once did. The political power born of the Civil War is crushed. The economic power, however, is merely transforming. The furnace of war is cold, but the land, depleted and scarred, must now feed a new kind of hunger. September 22, 1901. A sweltering platform at the State Fairgrounds in Birmingham, Alabama. The air smells of coal dust, popcorn, and sweat. Before a crowd of thousands, a haggard man with a neatly trimmed beard and the weary eyes of a failed farmer stands at a podium. He is William J. Samford, the governor, but he is not the main attraction. The crowd's electric anticipation is for the man he's about to introduce. Booker T. Washington, the most famous African-American in the nation, born into slavery in Virginia, now principal of the Tuskegee Institute in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt. Washington steps forward, and in what will be known as the Atlanta Compromise speech, though its philosophy was lived daily in Alabama, he outlines a brutal bargain. Black Southerners would forsake political agitation and social equality in exchange for economic opportunity and vocational education. The crowd, white politicians, industrialists, and press, erupts in applause. For the white power structure, it is a ratification of the new order. For many black Alabamians listening, it is a grim, pragmatic survival guide in a state actively building a cage of law and custom around them. The viewer stands at the crossroads of Alabama's post-Reconstruction identity. The Cotton Kingdom is diminished, its soil exhausted, its old aristocracy broke. But from its literal foundations, a new empire rises. In the north-central hills, where the remnant Cahaba coal field lies, a city is conjured from nothing. Birmingham, founded in 1871, is the magic city, its skyline a forest of smokestacks from blast furnaces. Here, the three raw ingredients, iron ore, coal, and limestone, sit in close proximity, a geological lottery ticket. The viewer in the 1880s would witness a hellish, thriving panorama. Convict laborers, disproportionately black, leased from the state in a system worse than slavery, mining the coal, immigrants from Europe and rural whites operating the roaring furnaces, and black workers doing the most dangerous, back-breaking jobs in the mills. Birmingham isn't just making steel. It's forging a new, industrialized social hierarchy, every bit as rigid as the plantation. While Birmingham booms, the rural Black Belt becomes an open-air prison of debt. Sharecropping and tenant farming replace slavery's chains with chains of credit. At the furnish store owned by the landowner, families buy seed, tools, and food on credit against their future crop. At harvest, the crooked ledger always shows they owe more than they made. It is peonage, economic slavery by another name. Escape is met with violence or arrest on trumped-up charges, leading back into the convict lease system that fuels industries like the Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company. This economic subjugation is codified by law. In 1901, Alabama ratifies a new state constitution. Its purpose, stated plainly by its framers, is to establish white supremacy by disenfranchising black men and many poor whites through poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause. Jim Crow becomes the state religion. Separate and unequal is etched into every facet of life. The water fountain, the schoolhouse, the cemetery. The terror of lynching enforces it. Between 1877 and 1950, over 300 documented lynchings occur in Alabama, public spectacles of torture and murder meant to terrify an entire population into submission. Yet within this crucible, resistance is forged not in open rebellion, but in institution building. At Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington preaches self-reliance, building a university brick by brick with student labor. His rival, W.E.B. Du Bois, though not an Alabamian, finds in the state's oppressive conditions the stark evidence for his call for political agitation. In Montgomery, a parallel black society thrives on Davis Avenue, with its own banks, insurance companies, and theaters, a world of dignified survival behind the veil. The two world wars act as accelerants. Black Alabamians migrate north in the Great Migration, fleeing oppression for factory jobs, sending back stories of a different world. At home, the Tuskegee Airmen train at Motton Field, their excellence in the sky a living contradiction to the doctrine of white supremacy that governs the ground below. The war's rhetoric of freedom against tyranny hangs in the Alabama air, thick and challenging. The viewer, leaving this era, stands on a threshold. The physical landscape has been remade twice, first by cotton, then by coal and steel. The social landscape is a dystopia of legalized apartheid, but the pressure is building. The furnaces of Birmingham have cooled in the Great Depression, but a new kind of heat is gathering. The generations born under Jim Crow have heard the promises of democracy, have fought for them abroad, and have built their own bases of strength and knowledge. The cage is strong, but its prisoners have spent decades studying its locks. The next section of Alabama's story will not be about the land being taken or the economy being built, but about the fundamental idea of justice being demanded, in a voice the whole world will finally be forced to hear. March 7, 1965. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, Selma, Alabama. The air is cool, charged with a fearful anticipation. You stand with a column of over 600 people, black teachers, maids, farmers, students, white clergy from the north, all linked arm in arm. You've just left Brown Chapel AME Church, singing, "We Shall Overcome." Before you, the bridge arches over the muddy Alabama River, its steel girders framing a scene of ominous stillness on the far side. There, blocking Highway 80, is a phalanx of Alabama state troopers in gas masks, blue helmets gleaming, and to their right, a mob of Dallas County Sheriff's posse men on horseback, some clutching baseball bats and cattle prods. Major John Cloud's amplified voice barks a command to disperse. A young man named John Lewis, his skull already scarred from earlier beatings, steps forward to speak. There is no negotiation. A trooper shouts, "Troopers, advance!" What happens next is not a riot. It is a mechanized, state-sanctioned assault. Troopers surge forward, clubs swinging. Tear gas canisters arc through the air, vomiting clouds of acid white. Horses rear and charge into the fleeing crowd, hooves and batons finding their marks. The day will be seared into history as Bloody Sunday, a televised atrocity that finally cracks the nation's conscience. But for the viewer on the bridge in that moment, there is only the chaos of violence, the sting of gas, the taste of blood, and the terrifying certainty that the state of Alabama would rather kill you than let you walk to Montgomery. This moment is the explosive culmination of a 20-year siege against Jim Crow's fortress. The story rewinds to the post-war simmer. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education ruling declared segregation unconstitutional. Alabama's response, etched in the 1956 legislative resolution, was outright defiance, nullification. The massive resistance was personified by Governor George C. Wallace, who in 1963 stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to symbolically block the enrollment of two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, declaring, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." But the movement was building its own power. It wasn't a single event, but a sustained campaign of disciplined, courageous confrontation designed to expose the brutality of the system. In 1963, Birmingham became Bombingham. The viewer that year would move through a city where the public spaces are battlegrounds. You see the Children's Crusade, where young students marching are met with fire hoses powerful enough to strip bark from trees and police dogs snarling at their flesh. You smell the acrid smoke from the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15th, after a Ku Klux Klan bomb kills 4 little girls, Addie Mee Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, in a place of worship and innocence. The images from Birmingham horrify the world and force President Kennedy to act. The movement's genius was its strategic choice of terrain. It targeted Alabama's most visceral contradictions. The Selma to Montgomery March was about the fundamental right to vote, the key to all other rights. The violence on the bridge was not a setback, it was the point. It forced America to watch what Alabama did to citizens asking for the ballot. 2 weeks later, with federal protection, the march proceeded. On March 25th, 25,000 people stood before the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery, the same building where the Confederacy was born. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. thundered, "How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law, its provisions directly targeting the discriminatory practices of Alabama and the Deep South. Yet even in victory, the cost was etched in stone. The Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail is a 54-mile scar of memory. The Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, with its water flowing over the names of the martyrs, is a testament to the price paid in blood on this soil. The movement shattered Jim Crow's legal structure, but Alabama's political landscape hardened in reaction. Wallace, the symbol of defiance, would wield power for decades, mastering a politics of racial resentment that would reshape national elections. The viewer leaving this era stands in a state transformed yet deeply divided. The old signs saying white and colored are gone, ripped down by law. But the economic disparities, the segregated neighborhoods, the unequal schools, and the embittered politics remain as a new landscape. The battlefield has shifted from lunch counters and bridges to school boards, city councils, and the quiet, persistent work of building real equality from the shell of legal freedom. The world had borne witness to Alabama's cruelty, and also to the unimaginable courage of its black citizens. The state's name was now synonymous with both the worst of America and the fight for its soul. The land where indigenous nations were erased had become the stage for a struggle that redefined what it meant to be American. June 1st, 2010. A control room in Decatur, Alabama, overlooking the Tennessee River. The air is cool, humming with the quiet pulse of supercomputers. On a massive screen, a digital simulation of a tornado spirals with terrifying realism. Here, at the National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center, and at places like the University of Alabama in Huntsville, meteorologists and scientists are parsing data from Doppler radar, a technology refined here in the heart of Tornado Alley. This scene is a world away from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but it is another face of modern Alabama, a center of technical precision and global scientific contribution, born from a necessity to understand the very skies that have so often ravaged the state. It is a symbol of a long, painful, and unfinished pivot, the struggle to redefine a place whose name, for decades, was a synonym for brutal resistance to progress. The viewer moving through the last quarter of the 20th century witnesses a state grappling with the aftermath of its own notoriety. The economic engines of the Old and New South are sputtering. The steel industry in Birmingham collapses in the 1970s and 80s, leaving the Magic City's furnaces cold and its workforce adrift. The textile mills follow. The state's politics, still dominated by the legacy of George Wallace, who made a late career appeal for black votes but whose policies entrenched division, struggle to attract the diverse, knowledge-based industries rising elsewhere. Yet in isolated pockets, a new map is being drawn. Huntsville, once a quiet cotton town, had been transformed by the space race. The Army's Redstone Arsenal and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, established in the 1950s and 60s, created a brain trust. By the 21st century, Rocket City is a global hub for aerospace engineering, defense contracting, and cutting-edge cybersecurity. It is an archipelago of the future in a state often seen as living in the past. Similarly, Mercedes-Benz's decision in 1993 to build its first North American assembly plant in Vance, near Tuscaloosa, sent shockwaves. It was not just an economic investment, it was a symbolic rupture. Alabama, the old Confederacy, became Auto Alley, attracting Honda, Hyundai, and a vast supplier network. The old cotton and steel muscles were being retrained for robotic assembly lines. But this reinvention exists in parallel with a persistent, deep-seated reckoning. The physical landscape becomes a palimpsest of memory and conflict. In Montgomery, a stone's throw from the imposing first White House of the Confederacy, the Equal Justice Initiative opens the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in 2018. The nation's first memorial dedicated to the over 4,400 victims of racial terror lynchings. Visitors walk among suspended, coffin-sized steel monuments, one for each county where the terror took place, the names of the dead etched forever. Down the street, the Legacy Museum charts the direct line from slavery to mass incarceration. This is not a nostalgic Old South tourism. It is a surgical, unflinching confrontation with the truth of the state's history. It forces the viewer to see the continuum, from the slave auction block to the convict lease mine to the prison industrial complex that disproportionately fills Alabama's penitentiaries with black bodies today. This tension between past and present defines the contemporary moment. The state boasts world-class universities and research centers, yet its public schools are chronically underfunded and often racially divided. It is a leader in automobile exports, yet some of its rural counties resemble the developing world in their poverty. It is a place where a black mayor can lead Birmingham, and where a Democratic Senator, Doug Jones, can win a historic election in 2017 by prosecuting the ghosts of the Klan, only to see the old political patterns reassert themselves later. The viewer today stands on land that holds all these layers. You can stand in a Creek sacred site preserved near Tuscaloosa, then drive to a state-of-the-art Hyundai plant. You can visit the Selma Interpretive Center on the bridge, then pass a monument to Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. You can hear the roar of a SpaceX engine tested in Huntsville, and the next day sit in a church in the Black Belt where the struggle for basic sewage infrastructure continues. Alabama's story, from the ancient mound builders to the digital coders, is ultimately a story of power. Who wields it, who contests it, and who writes its narrative? The land was never empty. It was targeted, fought over, stolen, industrialized, segregated, marched upon, and is now being slowly, painstakingly re-examined. Its global impact is profound. It shaped the cotton economy that fueled the Industrial Revolution. It was the cockpit of the crisis that gave America its civil rights laws. It builds the cars and rockets of the modern world. The original nations are not gone. They are federally recognized, reclaiming voice and stewardship. The descendants of the enslaved and the segregationists share the same soil, writing the next contentious chapter. The journey from the bluff at Atagi to the rocket test stands of Huntsville is not a straight line of progress. It is a spiral, where the same fundamental questions of justice, equity, and identity return again and again, each time on new terrain. The power of this land now lies in its unresolved tension, its raw, unvarnished history forever pressing against its uncertain, striving future. It is a mirror held up to America, reflecting both its original sins and its relentless, if uneven, struggle toward a more perfect union.